That watch belongs on the wrist of someone who actually matters, my son-in-law said with a grin as he pointed at the Rolex my late husband had given me 40 years ago. A few people laughed. A few looked away. I simply smiled. They all thought I was about to be embarrassed. None of them realized they were watching the beginning of the biggest mistake Jason Reed would ever make. I'm Evelyn Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and for most of my life I believed respect was something earned through character, hard work, and kindness. Lately, I had been learning that some people mistake kindness for weakness. The evening had started beautifully. The ballroom of the Lakeside Grand Hotel glowed with soft golden light, reflecting off crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved between tables carrying trays of appetizers, while a jazz trio played near the stage. Employees, investors, family members, and longtime friends had gathered to celebrate another successful year for Whitmore Industrial Solutions. According to the business magazines, the company was worth more than $10 million. According to most people in that room, the company belonged to the next generation now. I let them believe that. It made life simpler. I stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the lake. The water reflected the city lights like scattered diamonds. My black evening dress was simple and elegant. Around my wrist rested the watch that had become the center of attention. It was not the most expensive thing I owned, not even close, but it was the most valuable thing in my heart. My husband, Richard, had saved for years to buy it. He gave it to me on our 30th wedding anniversary. Every scratch on the metal carried a memory. Every tick of the second hand reminded me of the life we had built together. Still wearing that old thing? Jason asked as he approached with a glass of sparkling water in his hand. My daughter Claire walked beside him. She gave me a quick smile but seemed distracted, as though she already knew where the conversation was heading. I wear it every day, I replied. Richard wanted me to. Jason laughed. Well, Richard's gone now. Maybe it's time somebody else enjoyed it. Several people nearby turned toward us. I noticed the shift immediately. Conversations softened. Eyes drifted in our direction. People love family drama, especially when money is involved. It's not something that gets passed around, I said gently. It belongs to me. Come on, Evelyn, Jason said. You hardly need it. A watch like that should be worn by someone still building a future. He held out his wrist as if inviting me to place it there. A few nervous chuckles floated through the crowd. Claire looked down at the floor. That hurt more than Jason's words. She didn't defend me. She didn't tell him to stop. She simply stood there, silent. I remembered when Claire was 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. She used to run into our bedroom, carrying her blanket, and crawl between Richard and me. Back then, she would have defended me against the entire world. Now she wouldn't even defend me against her husband. Jason took another sip of his drink and smiled. Honestly, I'd make better use of it than you. The arrogance in his voice was polished and practiced. It hadn't appeared overnight. I had watched it grow year after year. Promotions came quickly. Success came easily. People praised him constantly. Somewhere along the way, confidence had transformed into entitlement. Maybe someday, he continued, you'll realize it belongs with the future instead of the past. I slowly touched the edge of the watch. The room felt strangely quiet. Not silent, just waiting. Waiting to see how the old woman would react. Waiting to see whether I would become emotional or angry. Instead, I smiled. That's an interesting perspective, I said. Jason looked pleased with himself. He thought he had won. He thought this was another moment where everyone would simply accept whatever he wanted. Across the room, I noticed Thomas Grant, our chief operating officer. He had been watching the exchange carefully. The expression on his face told me more than words ever could. Concern, hesitation, perhaps even warning. Something was coming. I could feel it. Jason raised his glass toward me. Think about it. Then he walked away, laughing with a group of executives. Claire followed him. She glanced back once, but only for a second. I stood alone beside the window. The city lights shimmered across the lake while the watch rested against my wrist. Richard used to tell me that people reveal their true character when they think there will be no consequences. That night, Jason revealed far more than he intended. And before the celebration was over, I would begin learning just how much he believed the company already belonged to him. The celebration continued around me as though nothing unusual had happened. Glasses clinked. Conversations drifted from table to table. The band moved into another familiar jazz standard. Yet I could not stop thinking about the expression on Thomas Grant's face. I had known Thomas for more than 20 years. He was not the kind of man who worried easily. If something troubled him, there was usually a reason. I remained near the window for another few minutes before making my way through the ballroom. Several employees stopped to greet me. Some had worked for the company since the days when Richard and I were still packing orders ourselves. They asked about my health. They shared stories about their families. Their warmth reminded me why we had built the business in the first place. It was never just about revenue or growth. It was about creating something that could support hundreds of ordinary people trying to build stable lives. Across the room, Jason seemed to be enjoying himself. He stood with a group of younger managers, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Every few moments, laughter erupted around him. He carried himself like a man who already owned the future. I watched him from a distance and noticed something I had been ignoring for too long. He was no longer trying to earn respect. He expected it automatically. That realization stayed with me as the evening moved forward. Later, dinner was served. I found my seat near several longtime investors. Jason and Claire sat at another table surrounded by department heads. During the meal, I noticed that Jason rarely listened when others spoke. He interrupted constantly. He corrected people even when they were right. He treated suggestions as challenges. Years ago, Richard would have noticed the same thing immediately. My husband had an extraordinary ability to judge character. He used to tell me that arrogance grows quietly. Most people do not recognize it until it has already taken root. As dessert arrived, an older investor named Harold Benson leaned toward me. Harold had known our family almost as long as Thomas had. He lowered his voice. "You have been spending less time at headquarters lately." I nodded. "That is true." He hesitated. "Maybe it is time for a closer look." Before I could ask what he meant, another guest approached our table and the conversation ended. Still, the comment lingered in my mind. It was the second warning I had received in a single evening. When the event finally began winding down, I stepped into a quiet hallway outside the ballroom. The noise faded behind the closed doors. For the first time all night, I was alone. A moment later, I heard footsteps approaching. Thomas appeared carrying a folder under one arm. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "do you have a minute?" I glanced at the folder. It was thick, far thicker than anything related to a routine matter. "Of course," I replied. Thomas exhaled slowly and looked back toward the ballroom to make sure nobody was nearby. "There are some things you need to know." His voice was calm, but something beneath it felt urgent. I looked at the folder again. Suddenly, Jason's behavior no longer seemed like a simple case of ego. The pieces were beginning to move together. And for the first time that evening, I had the uncomfortable feeling that my son-in-law had been hiding much more than disrespect. Thomas led me into a small conference room at the end of the hallway. The celebration continued somewhere beyond the closed doors, but the music sounded distant now. He placed the folder on the table between us and remained standing for a moment. I had seen that expression before. Years ago, during an economic downturn, Richard wore the same look when he knew difficult decisions were ahead. Thomas finally sat down and opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, internal reports, expense records, and copies of emails. The stack was far larger than I expected. "I have been trying to verify everything before bringing it to you," he said. "I wanted facts, not rumors." I nodded. "Start from the beginning." Thomas slid the first document across the table. Several executive expenses had increased dramatically during the previous 18 months. Luxury travel, premium accommodations, client entertainment budgets that seemed excessive. At first glance, nothing appeared illegal or even unusual. Successful companies often spent money to build relationships. Then I noticed a pattern. The approvals connected to many of the expenses carried the same name. Jason Reed. Thomas showed me another report. Then another. Small decisions that seemed harmless by themselves began forming a larger picture. Contracts were being awarded to vendors without competitive reviews. Experienced managers had been quietly replaced by people with personal connections to Jason. Long-standing procedures had been bypassed. None of it was dramatic. None of it would attract headlines. But together, it revealed something troubling. "How long has this been happening?" I asked. "Longer than most people realize," Thomas answered. He leaned back and rubbed his forehead. Many employees were afraid to speak up. Jason made it clear that questioning him could affect careers. I looked down at the documents. My stomach tightened. This was not the confident young man Claire married. This was someone who had begun believing that authority existed for his convenience. I remembered the first time I met him. He was polite, ambitious, and eager to impress. Richard liked him immediately. We both did. He talked about hard work and responsibility. He seemed grateful for every opportunity. Somewhere along the way, gratitude had disappeared. Thomas handed me a printed email exchange. I read it carefully. One sentence stood out. Jason referred to certain senior employees as obstacles from a previous generation. Obstacles. The word stayed with me. Many of those people had helped build the company from nothing. They had sacrificed weekends, holidays, and years of their lives. They were not obstacles. They were part of the foundation. There is more, Thomas said quietly. He opened another section of the folder. This time the documents involved future planning discussions, strategic projections, organizational charts, succession proposals. I studied the pages and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Jason had been positioning himself at the center of everything. Every roadmap led to the same destination. More control, more influence, more authority. My eyes moved slowly across the final page Thomas placed before me. At the top was a draft organizational structure prepared for an upcoming executive review. I searched for my name. It was not there. I looked again, assuming I had missed it. I had not. According to this plan, I no longer existed within the future of the company Richard and I had spent decades building. Thomas watched my reaction, but said nothing. He did not need to. The silence explained everything. And for the first time that evening, I realized the watch was never what Jason truly wanted. I remained in the conference room long after Thomas finished speaking. The folder sat open before me, but my attention had drifted somewhere else entirely. Through the darkened window, I could see reflections of the ballroom lights shimmering across the lake. Years earlier, Richard and I had stood beside another window in another building when our company was barely surviving. We had celebrated landing a contract worth $50,000. At the time, it felt enormous. We went out for hamburgers afterward because it was all we could afford. I smiled at the memory. Back then, every dollar mattered. Every customer mattered. Every employee mattered. We built the company one relationship at a time. Nobody handed us success. Nobody opened doors for us. We earned everything through persistence. Thomas quietly gathered several papers into a neat stack. I am sorry you had to see it this way, he said. Do not apologize, I replied. You did exactly what Richard would have wanted. His expression softened. He trusted you more than anyone. After Thomas left, I sat alone for another 15 minutes. Not because I was shocked. Strangely, I was not. Deep down, I think I had been noticing small warning signs for years. I simply chose not to connect them. A dismissive comment here, an unexplained decision there, a subtle shift in attitude. Individually, each moment seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Eventually, I returned to the ballroom. Most guests had already left. Staff members cleared tables and packed equipment. The celebration was ending. Near the exit, I spotted Claire waiting beside Jason. My daughter looked tired. Jason looked irritated. He was checking messages on his phone while speaking to someone about an upcoming executive meeting. Even now, he seemed completely focused on the next opportunity. Claire noticed me first. "Mom, are you heading home?" she asked. "In a few minutes," I said. She smiled politely, but something felt distant between us. We used to talk for hours. Now our conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes before Jason redirected her attention elsewhere. I wondered if she saw the changes in him. Or perhaps she saw them and convinced herself they were temporary. Many people do that when someone they love begins changing. They mistake warning signs for stress. They mistake patterns for exceptions. Jason finally looked up from his phone. "There you are," he said. "I was beginning to think you left already." "Not yet." He smiled confidently. "Good. There is something I wanted to discuss next week. Some future planning ideas." Future planning. The phrase almost made me laugh. I thought about the organizational chart hidden inside the folder. The version of the future where I no longer existed. "That sounds important," I replied calmly. "It is," Jason said. "The company needs fresh leadership for the next stage." I nodded. "I agree." He appeared pleased by my answer. For a brief moment, I could almost see his assumptions taking shape. He believed the road ahead was already clear. He believed nobody was paying attention. He believed authority belonged to him simply because he desired it. As I walked toward the parking lot a few minutes later, I touched the watch on my wrist and thought about Richard. Some legacies are protected by documents. Others are protected by people willing to defend them. And for the first time in a very long while, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The following Monday, I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual. The building looked exactly as it always had. Morning sunlight reflected off the glass exterior. Employees carried coffee cups through the lobby. Elevators opened and closed with their familiar chime. Yet everything felt different because I was seeing it with new eyes. For years, I had allowed myself to step back. I told myself the younger generation needed room to lead. I told myself experience meant knowing when to let go. Now I wondered whether I had confused trust with absence. I took the elevator to the executive floor and walked slowly through the hallway. Several employees seemed surprised to see me. Their reactions were polite but revealing. Some looked relieved. Others looked nervous. A few exchanged quick glances before returning to their work. Small details, the kind Richard always noticed. By mid-morning, Thomas joined me in the office that had once belonged to my husband. The room had remained largely unchanged. The same walnut desk, the same framed photographs, the same bookshelf filled with industry journals Richard refused to throw away. Thomas placed another folder on the desk, smaller than the first one, more specific. I spent the weekend reviewing additional records, he said. There are patterns you should see. We went through the documents together. Vendor approvals, budget revisions, staffing changes, one decision after another. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms individually. But together they revealed a leadership style built around personal influence rather than sound judgment. Several respected managers had resigned during the previous year. I recognized every name. People who rarely complained. People who believed in the company. Their departures suddenly made more sense. Did anyone raise concerns? I asked. Thomas nodded. Some did. Most eventually stopped. Why? He looked at me carefully. Because they believed nobody would listen. That answer stayed with me. Not because it reflected badly on the employees, because it reflected badly on me. Leadership is not only about making decisions. It is also about remaining present enough to hear uncomfortable truths. Around noon, I left the office and walked through several departments. I did not announce the visit. I simply observed. Employees greeted me warmly. Some shared updates about projects. Others spoke about their families. Gradually, the conversations became more honest. A supervisor mentioned constant executive turnover. Another employee described confusion surrounding recent directives. Nobody openly criticized Jason. They did not need to. The uncertainty in their voices said enough. Later that afternoon, I passed a conference room and noticed Jason leading a meeting. Through the glass wall, I watched him speak confidently while several managers listened. He appeared completely comfortable, completely certain. At one point, he pointed toward a presentation slide, and the room nodded along. Looking at him from a distance, it was easy to understand why people followed him. Confidence can be persuasive, especially when nobody questions it. He never noticed me standing there. I continued walking and returned to Richard's office. The city skyline stretched across the windows beyond the desk. For several minutes, I stood quietly and looked out over the buildings below. Then I opened a drawer and removed a leather portfolio Richard had kept for years. Inside were company ownership documents. I reviewed them carefully. Every page confirmed what I already knew. The future Jason imagined belonged to him existed only in his imagination. And for the first time since the celebration, I began planning exactly how to protect the legacy Richard and I had spent a lifetime creating. Over the next 2 weeks, I changed nothing on the surface. I attended meetings. I answered emails. I smiled during conversations in the hallway. If Jason noticed anything different, he never mentioned it. In fact, he seemed more confident than ever. That alone told me how little he understood about the company he believed he was preparing to control. One afternoon, I sat in Richard's old office reviewing ownership records with Benjamin Hart, the corporate attorney who had worked with our family for nearly 3 decades. Benjamin was methodical, careful, and impossible to impress. If he said something was secure, it was secure. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the final page before looking up. Everything remains exactly as Richard intended, he said. There are no surprises here. I nodded. Explain it to me one more time. Benjamin smiled slightly. He knew I already understood the answer. You maintain controlling ownership. Major structural changes require approvals that cannot happen without your authorization. Executive succession plans are recommendations, not decisions. The board answers to governance rules, not assumptions. Assumptions. That word seemed especially important, because assumptions were exactly what Jason had been building his future upon. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that visibility was the same thing as authority. He had mistaken influence for ownership. He believed that because people listened to him, the company already belonged to him. Benjamin closed the folder. Has he actually reviewed any of these documents? I almost laughed. I doubt it. Then he may not understand the position he is really in. I am beginning to realize that. After Benjamin left, I remained alone for a while. My eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf. Richard stood beside our first delivery truck wearing a faded blue work shirt and a smile that looked both proud and exhausted. We had built everything from scratch. There were years when we worked 6 days a week and worried constantly about payroll. Years when success felt uncertain. Years when every decision carried consequences. Nobody handed us a company. We earned it. The following morning, I attended an executive planning session. Jason led most of the discussion. He spoke confidently about expansion strategies, leadership transitions, and long-term organizational goals. Around the conference table, several executives took notes while others listened quietly. I said very little. Instead, I observed. Every proposal placed Jason closer to the center of decision-making. Every roadmap seemed designed around the same destination. More authority, more visibility, more control. At one point, he glanced toward me. "What do you think, Evelyn?" The room turned in my direction. I folded my hands and smiled. "I think planning for the future is important." Jason nodded, clearly satisfied by the answer. He assumed agreement where none existed. He mistook patience for approval. Once again, nobody challenged him. Once again, he left the meeting believing the path ahead was completely clear. As the executives filed out, Thomas remained behind. He closed the conference room door and lowered his voice. "The board meeting is in 3 weeks." I looked at him. "Are we ready?" Thomas hesitated for only a second. "We will be." I nodded slowly. 3 weeks. That was all the time remaining between assumptions and reality. And the most remarkable part was that Jason still had no idea the future he imagined had already begun slipping away from him. The morning of the board meeting arrived with unusual calm. The sky above the city was clear, and sunlight reflected off the neighboring buildings as I entered headquarters. Most people treated the day like any other. Employees moved through the lobby carrying laptops and coffee. Phones rang. Meetings began. Deadlines waited. Yet behind the ordinary routine, important decisions were about to be made. I arrived earlier than everyone else and spent a few quiet minutes in Richard's office. The watch rested against my wrist as always. I looked at the photograph on the bookshelf and remembered something my husband often said. Character reveals itself when people believe they have already won. Over the previous month, I had seen plenty of evidence that Jason believed exactly that. By 8:30, executives began gathering in the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I watched familiar faces take their seats. Some appeared relaxed. Others seemed anxious. Thomas sat near the far end of the table reviewing notes. Benjamin organized several folders in front of him. Everything had been prepared carefully. Everything would proceed according to established corporate procedures. A few minutes later, Jason entered the room. His confidence was impossible to miss. He greeted directors warmly and exchanged jokes with several executives. More than once, I noticed people congratulating him about future plans. He accepted the comments with the ease of someone who already considered success inevitable. When he saw me enter, he smiled. "Good morning, Evelyn." "Good morning, Jason. This should be a productive meeting." "I believe it will be." He nodded, clearly pleased by my response. Then he returned to speaking with several board members. As everyone settled into their seats, I observed him carefully. He looked completely comfortable, completely certain. The confidence might have impressed someone unfamiliar with the facts. Unfortunately for him, facts were exactly what would matter today. The meeting began with routine agenda items: financial performance, operational updates, strategic forecasts, department summaries. Jason participated enthusiastically throughout every discussion. He spoke often and with authority. Several times he referenced long-term leadership initiatives and future organizational planning. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody challenged him. The directors listened politely and took notes. Nearly 2 hours passed before the conversation finally reached executive governance matters. The atmosphere in the room changed almost immediately. Casual conversation disappeared. Attention sharpened. Benjamin opened one of the folders and distributed documents around the table. For the first time all morning, I noticed uncertainty cross Jason's face. It lasted only a moment, but it was there. He glanced toward the packet in front of him and then toward Benjamin. "What is this?" he asked. Benjamin remained calm. "Supporting materials for today's governance review." Jason flipped through several pages. His expression tightened slightly. Around the table, directors began reading. Nobody spoke. Paper turned quietly. Pens moved across margins. The silence felt heavier with every passing second. Thomas sat motionless beside me. We exchanged a brief glance, but said nothing. There was no need. Weeks of preparation had brought us to this moment. Assumptions were about to meet reality. Jason continued reading. The confidence that had filled the room earlier began fading from his expression. For the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely uncertain. And as the board members reviewed the evidence placed before them, I realized that the future Jason had been planning for was beginning to disappear right in front of him. The chairman of the board cleared his throat and looked around the room before speaking. "We will now review governance concerns raised during the preliminary audit." The words were calm, professional, and completely ordinary. Yet the effect on the room was immediate. Every conversation stopped. Every eye returned to the documents spread across the table. Jason sat perfectly still. He continued turning pages, but his earlier confidence was gone. Benjamin began presenting the findings one section at a time. There were no dramatic accusations, no emotional speeches, just facts. Vendor approvals that bypassed established review procedures. Executive expenditures that exceeded internal guidelines. Staffing decisions that ignored recommendations from department leadership. Individually, each issue might have been explained away. Together, they painted a picture of poor judgment and increasingly concentrated decision-making. Several directors asked questions. Benjamin answered each one carefully. Thomas provided supporting documentation when requested. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The process was deliberate and methodical. That was what made it so powerful. Facts did not need volume. They only needed clarity. Jason finally leaned forward. "I think this is being exaggerated," he said. "Every decision was made in the company's best interest." One director adjusted her glasses and looked down at the reports. "Then why were standard review procedures repeatedly ignored?" Jason hesitated. "Efficiency." Another director spoke next. "Why were multiple experienced managers replaced despite strong performance evaluations?" Jason shifted in his seat. "Leadership requires difficult decisions." The answers sounded less convincing each time he spoke. I remained silent and watched. Weeks earlier, I might have been tempted to intervene. Not anymore. The board deserved to see the situation exactly as it was. Eventually, the chairman turned toward me. "Evelyn, as controlling owner, do you wish to make a statement?" The room became completely still. Jason looked in my direction. So did everyone else. I folded my hands on the table. "Only this," I said. "This company was built on accountability. The same standards apply to everyone, regardless of title or family relationship." Nobody reacted immediately. They simply listened. Then the chairman nodded and continued the meeting. More documents were reviewed. More questions were answered. With every passing minute, the outcome became clearer. Jason seemed to realize it as well. The certainty he carried into the room had been replaced by something else entirely. Confusion, concern, perhaps even disbelief. I wondered if he was finally understanding the difference between influence and ownership. Near the end of the session, the board entered formal deliberation. The discussion remained professional, but the conclusions were difficult to ignore. Several directors expressed concern about leadership judgment. Others referenced declining confidence among senior staff. One after another, they described problems that could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents. Finally, the chairman looked around the table. "We are prepared to vote." Jason stared at the directors as though waiting for someone to stop the process. Nobody did. The votes were cast according to company procedure. One by one, hands were raised. The result became obvious long before the final count was completed. When the chairman announced the decision, the room fell silent once again. Jason's executive employment was being terminated effective immediately. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Jason slowly turned toward me. His eyes drifted to the watch on my wrist. For the first time since that night at the hotel, he seemed to understand something he had never understood before. The watch had never represented money. It represented a legacy, and the legacy he believed he could claim without earning had just closed its doors to him. 3 months later, the company felt different. Not because the building had changed or because the logo on the front entrance looked any different. The change was harder to describe and easier to feel. The tension that had quietly settled into the organization over the previous few years had begun to disappear. Employees spoke more openly. Managers collaborated more easily. Long postponed projects moved forward again. Confidence was returning, not because of one decision, but because accountability had returned with it. I spent more time at headquarters than I had in years. Not every day. I had earned the right to enjoy a slower pace of life. But I made sure people knew I was present. I attended leadership meetings. I visited departments. I listened. Most importantly, I paid attention. One afternoon, Thomas stopped by Richard's old office carrying quarterly performance reports. He placed them on my desk with a small smile. "You should see these." The numbers were encouraging. Client retention had improved. Employee satisfaction surveys showed stronger results. Several respected managers who had been considering leaving the company had decided to stay. None of those achievements appeared on magazine covers. None generated headlines. Yet they mattered more than most people realized. Healthy organizations are built through trust, not publicity. After Thomas left, I stood beside the window overlooking the city. The same skyline stretched across the horizon. The same streets below carried thousands of people through their ordinary lives. Some things never change. Others change completely. Claire called later that evening. Our relationship was still healing. Trust, once damaged, does not return overnight. But she had begun asking questions. Difficult questions. Honest questions. The kind people ask when they are finally ready to see situations clearly. We spoke for nearly an hour. Not about business. Not about board meetings. Not about past mistakes. We talked about family memories. About Richard. About the years before success complicated everything. When the conversation ended, I felt hopeful for the first time in a long while. As for Jason, his name rarely came up anymore. Life has a way of moving forward. The company moved forward. Employees moved forward. Even Claire was beginning to move forward. Holding on to bitterness would have served no purpose. Richard taught me that years ago. Protecting a legacy does not require carrying resentment forever. It simply requires knowing what deserves protection in the first place. A few days later, I found myself sitting alone in the office after most employees had gone home. The building was quiet. Evening sunlight painted long shadows across the floor. I looked down at the watch resting on my wrist. The metal showed signs of age now. Tiny scratches collected over decades. The clasp was not as shiny as it once was. Yet I treasured it more than ever. Not because of what it cost. Not because of how it looked. Because every mark represented time. Time shared with Richard. Time spent building something meaningful. Time invested in people who believed in our vision. I gently ran my finger across the edge of the watch and smiled. Months earlier, someone had looked at it and seen an object. A symbol of wealth. A prize to possess. But that was never what it represented. It represented sacrifice, commitment, responsibility. The things that cannot be inherited simply because someone wants them. As the final rays of sunlight faded beyond the city skyline, I gathered my things and prepared to leave. The company was secure. The people were thriving. The legacy Richard and I built remained exactly where it belonged. And I realized something important. Some people spend their lives chasing ownership. Others spend their lives earning stewardship. Only one of those paths leaves behind something worth remembering.